So before I get into Jack's story, let's go over the Alan Moore issue. For that, we are going to retread to the bygone year of 2000. And Alan Moore was writing the America's Best Comics for DC, one of which was an anthology series called Tomorrow Tales. So Tomorrow Tales was an homage to the old pulp comics. And it had several characters, like Johnny B. Quick, who was a child genius. There was some swords and sorcery. There was some science fiction. And there was a character called Cobweb. And Cobweb, as a character, was presented as a femme fatale who fought crime in as sexy a way as possible. And they often had her in different timelines, different iterations. But there was a story that Moore wrote featuring Cobweb that was blocked by DC Comics due to the subject matter. And this was adding to Moore's already growing dissatisfaction with DC, and was basically the straw that broke the camel's back, which led him to leave DC and really give up on mainstream publishers altogether. Now, let's go over what the subject of this story was, because it was based on, well, when I say real events, I will offer that maybe we take a grain of salt. These are matters that were reported as real events and involved two figures, and then these two historical figures having an interaction with Cobweb. Those two historical figures were Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. Now, I don't know if any of you, save maybe Storyteller and maybe some of you have, I'm sure many of you maybe aren't familiar with who Jack Parsons is. But I'm pretty sure you've all heard the name L. Ron Hubbard. So let's get into what this was. So first off, I feel if I'm going to make sure that this makes sense, I should explain first off who Jack Parsons is and why he was associated with L. Ron Hubbard. No, Nami, he didn't. That's the funny part. So, let's start with who was Jack Parsons. First off, here's the funny thing. His name was John Whiteside Parsons, known as Jack, but that's not what he was born as. When he was born, his name was Marvel Whiteside Parsons. I have to assume he decided he was tired of people looking at him funny when he told them his first name, and so just changed it to John and went by Jack. Now, Jack Parsons had two aspects of his life that made him interesting, especially when put together, because they almost seem at odds. So, Parsons was born rich, but was abandoned by his father as a teenager. And he did go to college, but he didn't get his degree. But I suspect he didn't get his degree because he found college most likely boring. Because the thing with Jack Parsons was he was a scientific genius. Even though he had no degree, he managed to join the Guggenheim Aeronautics Laboratory of the California Institute of Technology. he was literally a self-made rocket scientist. He did, in fact, conduct some of the earliest rocket research in the U.S. and was the pioneer of solid fuel, which led directly to the invention of JATO. In 1936, Mr. Parsons became one of the co-founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He is often credited with being one of the singular most important forces in creating modern rocketry. In fact, many people, including Werner von Buren, felt that Jack Parsons should have been considered the father of modern rocketry. However, many people didn't feel comfortable with him having that designation because of his other focus in life. For not only was Jack Parsons one of the country's leading rocket scientists, he was also one of America's leading occultists. You see, Parsons had become a member of the Ordo Templi Orientalis, or the OTO, also known as Thelema. This, just so you have context, was a religious order founded by Aleister Crowley. He was an acolyte. He actually knew Aleister Crowley personally. And he eventually rose to be the leader of the American branch of the OTO, leading what was known as the Agape Lodge. And in Parsons' mind, he saw no difference between his work as a scientist and his practices as a ceremonial magician. In fact, he was known to do invocations of Pan prior to rocket tests. All right, now, how do we bring L. Ron Hubbard into the story? Well, Parsons also had a great interest in science fiction, and he would seek out writers and other artists. He actually ran a boarding house that was nicknamed the Parsonage that catered to artists, writers, and scientists. And one of those writers at Parsons' boarding house was L. Ron Hubbard. So this is where it gets interesting. But first, I want to do a little bit more setup, and then we'll get into the meat of the story. Parsons was a married man. He was married to a woman named Helen Northrop. And Helen had a half-sister named Sarah, who came to live with them and ended up having an affair with Parsons. Obviously, Helen was not happy with this and left. And while they didn't, he didn't marry Sarah, they did continue their relationship. Now, why is this important? Well, now let's get back to Hubbard. So, you have Hubbard, you have Parsons. And they got on. They got on quite well. And they started practicing magic together. And they agreed to attempt a major magical ritual that was known as the Babylon Working. Now, I have some familiarity with the practices of the OTO, but I don't know any of the specifics. Certainly none of the specifics of this working. And there are various accounts, many of which I don't trust. And reason I don't trust these accounts is I feel there's a lot of sensationalism in them. But what I do have as that I count as with enough basis that I feel it's true was that the purpose of the Babylon working was to produce an entity known as the Moonchild. Now, the Moonchild purportedly was a being that would usher in a new age for mankind. And a part of the working was intended to find a third member for the ritual. And this third member of the ritual would be known as the Scarlet Woman. Eventually, our pair of occultists found a lady named Marjorie Cameron. And she did join them in the ritual. Now, we don't know what happened. There's no documentations of the ritual. The only thing we know for sure is eventually Parsons announced that they had completed the ritual and it was a success. Now, this is where I feel more took interest. Because obviously this is where you have the intersection of Parsons and Hubbard. So, and knowing that Moore has a deep fascination with Thelema and the works of Crowley, that I feel he was intrigued by the Babylon working. And my feeling is he was going to take the character of Cobweb and bring her into the story. Now, because of her femme fatale aspect, some people figured he wanted her as the Scarlet Woman. But personally, I think it's more likely that Moore was going to claim that Cobweb was the Moonchild. But either way, it was the fact that the story involved L. Ron Hubbard that made DC Comics go, no, we don't want to put this out. We don't want trouble from the Scientologists. Even though, as was questioned earlier, this wasn't a screed against Scientology. This was going over matters that involved Hubbard before the foundation of Scientology. But it's what made DC get cold feet. Now, also, maybe they were nervous because they knew about the aftermath. You see, after the Babylon working was done, Parsons, Hubbard, and Sarah Northrop, his mistress, decided to go into business together and run a boating company. Now, Parsons was the money man. He put up the majority of the money to start the business. And this is where things went south. Now, there are stories that Aleister Crowley had, and this by stories I mean letters, that Aleister Crowley had warned Parsons to be wary of Hubbard because Crowley considered Hubbard a con man. I want you to think about this for a second. I want you all to meditate on the words I just said. Aleister Crowley considered L. Ron Hubbard a con man. All right. Now, and well, obviously, and he warned Parsons that Hubbard was going to find a way to screw him. And specifically was going to make off with the money and probably Sarah. And shockingly, that's exactly what happened. Hubbard and Sarah Northrop went off to buy the first boat. And instead of bringing it back, they just made off with it and the rest of the company's funds. Now, this is where, again, we're going to take events as they have been reported. Because according to Parsons, he borrowed a page from the Bard of Avon, Shakespeare, specifically The Tempest, and summoned a storm that forced them back to port. And then after he summoned the storm to force them back to port, he then went the more mundane route of suing them to get his money back. And he did recover much of the money, but Hubbard was allowed to keep the boat. This is why there's a joke amongst the OTO members today of when they encounter Scientologists, it's like, we want the boat back. Now, just to tie the story up, Hubbard ended up marrying Sarah Northrop, which is okay. Parsons married the Scarlet Woman, Cameron. And it's not like this was suddenly Parsons was down and out. He managed to bounce back from it. He, he still had his work with JPL. He was still a noted rocket scientist. He still had his boarding house. And he still managed his work as an occultist. If you're interested, he did write many essays on magical practices and philosophies. So you can, they were collected in a book called Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. But yes, in 1952, Parsons died in an explosion in his home laboratory. Now, some people try to claim that he committed suicide, or that he was performing a magical ritual that went awry. And I honestly don't buy either of those stories. Science can be a dangerous endeavor, especially when you're dealing with rocketry. So I think it's exactly what it looked like. He was doing an experiment and it got away from him. He worked with rocket fuel. He was trying something and it went kaboom. And he's, Parson has shown up from time to time in literary works. Moore did actually find a place to put him. He included Parsons in an issue of Promethea. One of Paramount, the Paramount Network, did a series about Jack Parsons, highly fictionalized, called Strange Angel. You have to look at the significance of his work. I mean, just as a rocket scientist, he was one of the founders of Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He discovered the basis of solid rocket fuel. Which, folks, that's one of the reasons we got to the moon. But again, he passed in 52 before a lot of the really interesting rocketry happened. But even von Buren said that he was building a lot of his work off of Parsons. And what does that say? That the U.S. government was more comfortable with von Buren than Parsons. They were more comfortable with the scientists that they pulled from the Third Reich through Project Paperclip than they were by the American scientist who happened to be an occultist. So that's Jack Parsons and the saga of Alan Moore and why he left DC Comics.